Okay, recording just started. We welcome to the Manhattan GMAT Study Hall for March 31st. We are going to look at the use of which modifiers, the use of pronoun ambiguity and sentence correction, and then after halftime we're going to talk about coordinate geometry, data sufficiency, part 2. So we have to start off with the usual warnings. So here's that. First of all, submitted problems. Please don't submit problems that are too general. So people are getting a little bit better about this. I don't think we've had too many submissions this past couple of weeks that have been too general. So that's good. We like that. On the other hand, people are still submitting topics that are much too specific. In fact, people are getting a little bit worse about this. This right here, submitting things that are too specific. Sorry, let's get that off the screen. We've had a lot of submissions in the last couple of weeks that have just given us like one problem and said, how do I solve this one problem? Okay, again, guys, please don't do that. When you submit questions, please make it some sort of general question that can be generalized meaningfully in some way. Like if you just give us one problem to solve, say here's a particular problem, what's the difference between choice A and choice B, or something like that. That's what our forums are for. So again, please do not post single problems. Please post, if you do post a single problem, please post some kind of general question or general topic area related to that question, but not so general that it's meaningless. Like please don't submit something like all of geometry. Finally, we had a couple of these last couple of weeks too. So again, please pay attention. We also don't want you to submit personal issues. Okay, please don't say things like these are my scores, this is my goal, how do I get there? Again, remember this is a study hall that is watched by hundreds of different people. So it's not really appropriate for us to respond to individual study plans. As far as what you should submit, again, intermediate depth. So this was one of the decently recent topics. Coordinate geometry data sufficiency is the right kind of depth too. It's not so specific that we can just answer it on the forum, but it's also not so general that it would be, hundreds of hours. It's the right level of depth. Pronoun ambiguity issues, that's the right level of depth. It's a single focused topic, but still general enough for us to cover. And so on. So that's the rules as far as submissions. And again, please, people, no official guide problems. You've got to tell us where the problems come from, and that means official, original sources. So don't tell us you got it off of a forum, because forums are secondhand sources. Please tell us it was originally written by these or those people. If you don't know who the original authorship of the problem is, then unfortunately we can't use it. And again, please, no official guide problems. We can't use those. Okay, smiley face if you guys understand these rules. Again, the smiley face icon is located over there. Okay, good. Now let's look at the next warning, usual warning page. Again, please check the archives. Probably 20 or 30% of our submissions from the last couple of weeks is stuff that we have already covered. We had one person ask about the least extreme negation, aka reversal method. That's already there in March 4th, critical reasoning assumptions. We had one person ask about sequence notation. That's already covered on July 8th, etc. So please check. There are already 31 sessions or something like that, some large number of sessions already recorded. So please check the archives for such recordings before you decide to post a new topic. Okay, and again, smiley face if this is understood. Okay, thanks, and let's go ahead and get started here. So we're going to kick off with a sentence correction problem. That problem is, this is a GMAT prep problem, which also appears in the official guide. But the reason we're allowed to use it is because it is on GMAT prep. So I'll give you a 2-minute timer. By the way, here's how we want you to respond to these questions. I'm going to give you a polling tool, multiple choice A through E options. Okay, so what you should see here is this. It'll appear on your screen in a second. What you should see is this. Okay, when you answer questions, again, please, 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 when you answer questions, use the multiple choice buttons that appear to the left. Please do not answer the questions in the text box so that we don't have everybody seeing your answer and having an unfair type of situation. Okay, so the multiple choice buttons on the left, smiley face if everybody sees the multiple choice problems on the left. Multiple choice buttons, A, B, C, D, E, smiley face if you see that. Okay, some of you are not responding, most of you are, so good stuff. Here's the problem. I'll give you a timer for about a minute 45 or so. Again, please answer using the multiple choice buttons. Thank you. Have fun. Okay, let's do it. Let's take a look at these options here. And a couple of you still don't have choices selected. There's a Danielle who's currently having connection trouble, but there's also Sonakshi and 2 Shots of Happy and a couple other people. Please pick an answer. Remember this, the GMAT, you're not allowed to not pick an answer. So, okay, let's take a look. Here are your statistics. So the class was, the group's about evenly split between A and E. Let's take a look at these two things. People who thought that E was incorrect, go ahead and think, why did you think that? Go ahead and type in the text box why you thought E was incorrect. Okay, so we've got some people thinking that which modifies Dickinson. So let's take a look at that and see if that's true or not. Okay, can you guys still hear me okay? Smiley face if you can. A little bit of audio issues here. Okay, let's talk about the use of which, because it turns out the correct answer to this problem is actually E. So let's update our knowledge of how which modifiers work according to this new knowledge. So here's the, let's make a new slide where we copy some of these let's make a new slide where we copy this with the correct answer here. So that'll take me just a second. Okay, here's the correct answer. Yeah, we need to do a little bit of surgery here. To Susan Huntington Dickinson, so let's blank that out and blank that out. Here's the correct answer choice. Emily Dickinson's letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson, which were written over a period beginning a few years before Susan's marriage. Okay, let's have a discussion about this which modifier. This is the correct answer, so we have to have a modification that actually makes sense. I mean, remember that the meaning of the sentence is of paramount importance here. So if the modifier doesn't modify something that actually makes sense, then it's incorrect. So in the text box, let's talk about what does which modify in this case. A couple of you are still typing. Yeah, it modifies the letters. Let's talk about how that can work, because what we teach a rule in the book, which is a little bit on the rigid side. It's purposely a little bit overly rigid so that people get used to the rigor of the rule. We don't really want to introduce all these subtleties at the same time. But once you learn how, I mean, the basic rule of which modifiers, let's come back to that real quick. The basic rule of which modifiers is that they modify the noun that precedes the comma. Okay, this is the first thing you generally tend to learn about which modifiers. Okay, on the other hand, this is a basic rule, and in the case of instances like this, we're going to need to modify this rule. So, a little bit more fine-grained look at this. More accurately, a which modifier can modify. It can modify the immediately preceding noun. I mean, of course it can. The noun that immediately precedes the comma. I mean, that can definitely work. So the rule that you've learned is not wrong. But the update that we need is that it can also modify the noun plus prepositional phrase that immediately precedes the comma. So either one of these. It can modify a noun or a noun plus a prepositional phrase. If anybody here doesn't know what a prepositional phrase is, then please type that in the text box and we'll cover that real quickly. If anybody doesn't know what a prepositional phrase is. Otherwise, we'll continue. So in this case, what we're modifying is Emily Dickinson's letters is the noun, and to Huntington Dickinson is a prepositional phrase. So let's write that out here just to make sure we can graph this. Emily Dickinson's letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson, which were written. So notice, here's your which modifier. Since either one of these is an allowed option, we can just use context to figure out which way it works. So this way, if it just modified Susan Huntington Dickinson, then that would be just a noun. But if it modified all of this letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson, then that would be the noun plus prep phrase. So the gold underline is the noun, the red underline is the noun plus prep phrase. So using context or grammar, we can figure out which one of these are which modifier is modifying. So let's analyze both of these things. For the gold one, context will analyze and grammar will analyze. Context, grammar. In the case of the gold one, the context doesn't really make sense because you can't write a person. So it's nonsense context because Susan Huntington Dickinson can't be written. Whereas the red one makes sense in context because the letters were written. And then grammar, there's actually two things wrong with the grammar of Susan Huntington Dickinson here. Who can tell me in the text box what those are? There's two grammatical reasons why the modifier can't. So Gaurav, what about were written? I mean, yeah, that's a problem. Were is plural, so that doesn't work. You don't have subject-verb agreement. So that's the first point. SV disagreement because SHV is singular, but were is plural. There's also another thing that's not okay with the grammar or usage of this. Does anybody know what that is? As a hint, the word is which. Does that ring any bells with anybody? Someone saying passive voice, make sure you know that passive voice is not an error. Okay, that's one thing that some people have this idea that passive voice is wrong. The passive voice is absolutely not wrong, and in a lot of cases it's it's required, and in other cases it's preferred. And I mean E is the correct answer to this question, so obviously passive voice is not an issue. Yeah, the other problem is the word who. I mean, you can't use which to refer to people. So which, remember, only the word who or whom, whose can be used for people. Which can't refer to people. But the grammar and usage of the red version is perfect. I mean, the letters were written. That makes sense in terms of both singular and plural, and the which and who issue. Like you actually do want to use the word which for letters. You don't want to use the word which for SHD, but that's not what we're pointing to. So as it turns out, in this case, the modifier which is actually pointing to all of this, not just Susan Huntington Dickinson. So the main lesson of this particular slide is this box right here. A which modifier can either modify the noun that precedes the comma or modify the noun plus prepositional phrase. And in general, you're going to have to use context to figure out how this works. So we'll come back to the rest of the problem in a second, but let's go through another couple examples of how this modifier is used. So again, here's the box from the previous page. Which can either modify the preceding noun or it can modify the preceding noun plus prep phrase. And the new point that we're going to make on this slide is that you're going to have to use context to figure out which of these is the case. So let me just give you two examples. If you say the old Capitol building in Benicia, which was the capital city of California for a few years in the 19th century, is a historic landmark, versus the old Capitol building in Benicia, which was built in under a year when the city was designated capital of California. Is now a historic landmark. Okay, these sentences are both correct, and let's just make sure that you guys understand why. So let's talk about the which modifier in each of these sentences. So here's a which in the first sentence, comma which. In the text box, what is that modifying? Okay, we've got a couple of people saying building. I mean, remember that when you read, you need to understand the context of the sentence. So yeah, the context of the sentence here is that Benicia was once the capital of California. Actually was, if any of you know California. It's like this little out-of-the-way town now, but it was capital for a while. So the only thing that makes sense here is we're talking about Benicia, which was once the capital city of California. So this is a modifier that works the normal way that the book describes as a starter, where this is just talking about Benicia. You can figure that out from context. So in this case, this one modifies the noun only. All right, modifies the noun only. Smiley face if that makes sense. If you have any questions, please type them in the text box. Okay. What about the other one? this which modifier right here, what does this modify? Please type in the text box. Yeah, this is the Capitol building. Capitol building, by the way, you would treat as one word. I mean, you don't really treat that as a separate two words kind of construction. So this is the Capitol building, and then, by the way, notice the GMAT doesn't test spelling, but just, for fun, notice the difference in spelling between the two versions of Capitol. A capital with an O is a building, but a capital with an A refers to a city. So like the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. is also a building. So you don't want to use AL for a building. Fun fact about weird English spellings. But yeah, this is a noun plus prepositional phrase. Again, context tells us that we're not talking about the city because we said the city somewhere else. So we must be saying that the building was built in under a year. So this is the building in Venetia, the Capitol building. So this one refers to the noun plus prep phrase. These are both legitimate. We only have one example problem today because, frankly, once we've given you this rule, you have the rule, and to give more examples would be sort of redundant. But here's our example problem. We'll go ahead and just do a quick coverage of the rest of what's happening in this problem in a second. But we do have a correct answer in which the which modifier is referring to letters to Susan Huntington Dickinson. Any questions about these two examples? Smiley face if these make sense. Questions in the text box if you've got them. Okay. Now, just a quick review. I think most of you know this stuff already, so we'll blaze through this really quickly. But let's talk about how not to use a which modifier. How not to use which modifiers. As usual, spoken language, not the same thing as written language. I mean, this is an ongoing theme in sentence correction, is that you should not correct sentences to be like the way that you talk. But this is especially urgent in the case of modifiers, where very, very few modifiers are ever used the way that they're used when people talk. Like in spoken language, here's how which is almost always used. If you have something like this, here's how people talk. They would say something like, I haven't done my taxes yet, which means that I'm not going to sleep tonight. Okay, this is the way that native speakers of English talk. All right, someone tell me in the text box, what is the speaker trying to use the word which to modify in this sentence? What is the speaker trying to do? It's not right as far as written language goes, but what are they attempting to do? Yeah, they're trying to use it to modify this whole clause here. So this is not legit. I mean, something like, some of you are pointing to different parts of it, but it's more or less is this entire idea. So this is how native speakers of English normally use it when they talk. So in spoken language, if you think about it, when you listen to people talk in spoken English, this is what they almost always do. So in spoken language, which is almost always used to modify entire preceding clauses. Right? In written English, this is wrong. Make sure you don't do it. In GMAT prep, there are lots and lots and lots of problems in which this is done. It doesn't make it correct, it just makes it a very frequent incorrect answer. Like, let me go ahead and dig up a few examples of this. If you, if you say, like, here's a GMAT prep problem. I'm just going to throw one onto the board. It'll appear on your screen in a second. Okay, this is from GMAT prep. Notice choices D and E. Choices D and E are using which in the way that spoken language uses which. So this is not okay, you can't do this. This is a spoken language style usage of the which modifier. It's incorrect. You can't do that. Okay. The other way you don't want to use which modifiers is basically to modify anything other than a noun plus prep phrase. So remember, this is specifically noun plus prep phrase. What we have not seen ever correct on the GMAT is you also cannot use which, as far as we've seen. You also cannot use which to modify noun plus modifier if the modifier is anything other than a prepositional phrase. So that's why we are as specific. That's why we didn't just say noun plus modifier on the previous page, because it has to be this one particular type of modifier, prepositional phrase. So other types of modifiers, not okay. So for instance, if you said the old Capitol building that was built in Benicia, which, that's not okay anymore, because that's more than just a noun plus a prepositional phrase. So right now you've got two possibilities for which. We've got noun only and noun plus prep phrase. We have not seen evidence of other types of modifiers being okay here attached to the noun. It's definitely wrong to use which to modify a clause. Like there's 100% certainty that this is incorrect in written language. The issue of nouns plus other modifiers has not really 100% been settled. Like they haven't actually come out and said prep phrases only, but the evidence that we have accumulated is that other kinds of modifiers after which are not generally okay. If we find anything to the contrary, I'll make sure to mention it in the future session. Manoj, if you don't know what a prepositional phrase is, what you're probably better off doing is going to Google and just looking up a definition of it, and you'll find lots and lots of detail about that. Much more detail than I could reasonably give right now spontaneously in class. So go ahead and check. Any sort of basic grammatical definitions, same thing with the forum. Like some people are posting to the forum questions like, what is the passive voice? That's not the kind of thing you want to put on the forum. Like that's a basic definition, so look it up on the internet. It'll be in like 6,000 places. The kind of things that you want to give here and in the forum are things like, I mean, if enough people in the class don't know these things, then we'll quickly go over it. But especially on forums, make sure you guys don't post basic grammar questions, because if you do, you're going to wait 3 or 4 days for an answer to a question that you could have just Googled. So make sure you don't do that. Okay. The rest of this problem, let's go over it very quickly because the rest of the problem is not really the issue, but let's look at it anyway. Here's the problem. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. First of all, you have a parallelism issue. Remember, you should be looking for parallelism in just about every problem. You have the period beginning and ending, so the forms of begin and end should be parallel. So let's see how we do on that. Here's beginning and here's ending. That works. Here's that begins and ended. That doesn't work. This is beginning and that ends. That doesn't work. This is beginning. This is comma ending. So in this case, you don't have a parallel structure. This is a different kind of error in the sense that it's still an error. Like here, there's no parallel structure, but there should be, because here, comma plus ending is written as a modifier. Shouldn't be a modifier. These things should be parallel to each other. So you have parallelism issues in B, C, and D. Beginning and ending here are fine. Again, B and C, the issue is normally, it's like normal parallelism issue. They're not parallel and they're supposed to be. D is a little bit different because they're not written as a parallel structure when they obviously should be. So it doesn't make sense to have this as a common ing modifier here. I mean, there's also the modifier itself is incorrect too. Yeah. Okay. Or the other way, thank you, Samarjit, thanks for that. That's one way to interpret it as a modifier, or you can interpret it as a series of beginning, ending, and outnumbering. But then that doesn't make sense either, because then you have 3 items in parallel, which are not supposed to be. So either way, you could interpret this as beginning and then a common ing modifier, in which case that's wrong, or you can interpret it, thank you, Samarjit, as beginning, ending, and outnumbering, which is also not okay, because that's a parallelism between 3 things that should not be parallel. Okay. There's other errors in those 3 choices, but the parallelism is the one you should be definitely looking for. Now let's talk about A and E. E is correct. The which works for the reasons that we've just talked about. Yeah, D doesn't have a main verb. It's also a fragment. As I said, we're not going to go over every error in all of these choices right now. But D, yeah, correct. D is also a sentence fragment. So that's a good point. And you can, this problem is on the forum. If you guys have other questions about the other choices, this problem exists in several threads on the forum. So if you want to post extra questions on the forum, I'll go ahead and give you that. I'll give you a link in a second. Does anybody know what's wrong with A? Okay, Homer Simpson's starting to get a hang on it. He says it doesn't make sense. I mean, that's sort of vague, but it is a meaning error, so that part we're grasping onto correctly. Let me give you 2 examples as an analogy. No, it's not a grammatically incorrect sentence. The grammar of A is fine. There's no error in the grammar of choice A. Here are some analogies for A. Here are 2 sentences. First sentence is, my cousin took extra classes every semester in college, comma, graduating in 3 years. Versus, my cousin ate frozen food every day in college, comma, graduating in 3 years. The first one of these is correct. The second one of these is incorrect. Can anybody tell me what's wrong with the second one? Text box. Yeah, you need to have a relationship. I mean, there are very particular rules on how comma plus ing modifiers work. But in general, the basic rule for these modifiers is they have to modify. And I mean, a modifier has to actually make sense, modifying what it modifies. So here's comma graduating. This thing actually has to modify the preceding clause. that's how comma plus ings work when they follow full sentences, is they modify that whole clause, that whole action. So the problem is that the first one of these works. I mean, if you take every, that's a valid modifier for that kind of structure because it tells you an immediate consequence of taking all these extra classes in college. On the other hand, this clearly doesn't because eating frozen food has nothing to do with graduating early. So let me re-emphasize there are no grammar errors in either of these sentences. Again, some people tend to be very excessively focused on grammar. Do not be excessively focused on grammar. I mean, remember that sentences they have to have a meaning, and that meaning has to make sense. So most errors actually touch on meaning in some way or another. So if you are only thinking about grammar, then you will probably not be able to solve something like half of all the problems that you see. So be careful. Okay, A has the same problem as the latter of these two sentences. Let me elaborate real quick. A has the same issue, which is the letters were written over time period X, comma, outnumbering her letters to anyone else. The problem is that these two are unrelated to each other. I mean, the time period has nothing to do with outnumbering other letters. That doesn't have anything to do with anything. So this doesn't work as a modifier. Versus if you had another sentence with something like this. If you had like the letters were written 4 times a day for 30 years, comma, outnumbering her letters to anyone else, then this would be correct. Because then 4 times a day for 30 years is clearly very strongly related to the fact that these things outnumber all of her other ones. But this one, there's no relationship at all, so it doesn't make any sense. Okay, smiley face if you guys understand this distinction here. Okay, good. Notice that which modifiers do not have to have any sort of relationship to the surrounding sentence. I mean, for the sake of not sounding like a weirdly schizophrenic person, they should have some sort of relationship somewhere. But there's no required relationship. So you could say my cousin, comma, who ate frozen food every day, comma, graduated in 3 years. That would be fine. I mean, it's still a very weird sentence, but it's not incorrect because which doesn't imply any sort of relationship. But the comma ing modifier absolutely does imply a relationship, so you have to be careful. So that's why, I mean, if you're going to express an unrelated extra fact, then a which modifier is a nice tool for doing that. Okay, somebody asked a question about the which modifier with a comma. Let me elaborate on that. Which modifiers and commas. Okay, if you have which by itself, then that, as far as GMAT usage, must follow a comma. Okay, on the other hand, prepositional phrase, or preposition plus which, may or may not follow a comma. That's your rule. So, I mean, they're not going to split. This is more of an American versus British convention than anything else. So if you guys learn British English, you may be a little bit surprised by this. But if you say something like, on the table was a box, which, on the table is a box, which contains all my paperwork. This is correct. If you say on the table is a box which, no comma, contains all my paperwork, This is not acceptable on the GMAT. Instead of which, what word would you use there? Text box, anybody? Yeah, you would use that instead of which. So, again, in British usage, the second sentence would probably appear a lot. So if any of you learned Commonwealth English, this is probably a little bit of a surprise. But on the table is a box that contains all my paperwork. This is acceptable. On the other hand, if you have a preposition preceding that which, if your modifier is in which or of which or at which or according to which, then either way is fine. So if you say, let me do this more efficiently. Let's copy and paste. All right, we're going to make some small mods to these here real quick. On the table is a box in which I keep all my paperwork. On the table is a box, comma, in which I keep. The difference, these are both acceptable. The difference is a very writerly kind of thing. It's not tested on the GMAT, so I don't really want to get into it right now because it would be a distraction. It's not anything that's ever actually tested that we've seen. But if you are interested in the difference between those two, you can Google it. It's called essential versus non-essential modifiers. So if you're into that sort of thing. Okay, but if you have in which, these are both acceptable. Which by itself, not so much. Smiley face, if you understand this. Any questions, go ahead and type. Otherwise, we will move on. Okay, it's kind of a weak response. I only got about 7 smileys. I have 27 people. Let's try that again. Smiley face if this is all good. Okay, excellent. Let's move on. Let's take a look at this. Go for it. I'll clear out your answers. Here's a timer. Give you about 1:20 for this one. Okay, again, I think we have some latecomers here, but please, guys, please answer the questions with these buttons that are over on the left. Please do not answer them in the text box. Okay, we got a couple people who haven't answered. Most of you have, so if you have not answered, please indicate something in the next few seconds. Thank you very much. Cyrus, Chan, I don't have an answer from you. Sonakshi, 2 shots of happy. I don't have an answer from you guys. Please indicate something. Remember, it's the GMAT. You're not allowed to not answer the question. So, Cyrus and Sonakshi and 2 shots of happy, please indicate something. Okay, apparently those people don't feel like answering the question. So, okay, 2 of you just did. Again, please only press the button once. So actually I see your answer appearing and disappearing and appearing and disappearing. That means you're repeatedly clicking the answer. Right now it's off, so please click it again. Okay, there you go. Here's the answers from the class. There you go. One of those non-responses is me, and the 2 others are people with technical difficulties, so you can ignore that. Okay, let's talk about this. People who thought that, let's see. People who thought that A was wrong. Why did you think that A was wrong? Okay, so the possessive, all right, because it turns out that A is the correct answer here, so there's a takeaway there. In general, possessives are fine. You know, using apostrophe plus S are fine. The use of these things is, it's really highly idiomatic, and it's one of those things that basically if you're not a native speaker, you don't really have much of a chance of ever understanding fully. So, two things about possessives versus of. I mean, first, I haven't actually seen a problem on which possessive, like apostrophe S versus of, is required to solve the problem. And I mean, the reason why they don't do that is, again, it's one of those, it's kind of like the use of a, and the. Those are two things that, unless you are a native speaker of the language, it is practically impossible to ever master fully. Because, I mean, the usage of these things are just so subtle and idiomatic and individualized that it's very difficult to learn. So I wouldn't use that. I mean, the differences are extremely subtle and difficult to understand if English is not your native language. So I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't go with the possessive. Let's talk about especially versus specially. We'll do that really quickly. There is a split there, which is especially means more so than others. Means to a greater extent than others. Whereas specially means in a special way, or like with extra special care or something like that. So if you say something like especially, we want this to be especially. Like if you say, let's say something like, this chemical is especially dangerous because it can methylate atoms in your body, or molecules in your body. This is especially meaning more so than other chemicals. So you wouldn't say especially, you would say especially. Especially is more like, you know, the food had to be prepared, had to be specially prepared for the guests with unusual allergies. Meaning they had to cook this food in a way that was special. So not especially, they didn't have to cook it any more than they had to cook anybody else's food, but it had to be specially cooked. It had to be made in a way that was unique and special and weird. So, I mean, that's the difference there. We don't want specially, so that's one reason why these bottom two are wrong. And then there's idioms. Remember, idioms don't have rules, so you just have to kind of know what works and what doesn't. The ability to deal, you don't say ability in dealing. So ability plus infinitive, ability to do something. Capability of dealing, I haven't really seen capability with any sort of prepositional phrase after it. I don't know this for sure, but I don't think that you can put a prep phrase or modifier after capability. Let me just look up what I can here about this real quick. Okay, maybe not. I'm going to refrain from dealing with that because I don't know what the rule is for capability. It could. I think I've seen capability of doing something, but I don't know if the GMAT likes that or not. Capability in dealing is definitely not okay. Neither is ability to in dealing. So I will tell you for sure that this is not okay. I don't know whether these idioms, capability of dealing or capability to deal, are okay. First of all, the question in the text box isn't C passive. First of all, no, it's not passive. But second of all, remember, as I said about 10 or 15 minutes ago, the passive voice is not an error. Passive is, in fact, the passive voice, since people have been asking about this 3 or 4 times already today, let me make a separate slide for this. The passive, whoa, how'd that happen? Okay, the passive voice, guys, is not an error. All right, sure you know this. Okay, in fact, there's not even a definite preference one way or the other. Like if you have, the passive voice just means that the subject is the recipient of the action instead of doing the action. So active means the subject is the actual agent or doer of the action. So if you say something like, Mike moved to Atlanta, then this means that Mike actually got up and moved to Atlanta of his own accord. So Mike got up and moved to Atlanta all by himself, or at least for his own reasons. All right, on the other hand, if you, okay, the passive voice, again, if you don't know what active and passive are, make sure that you look that up on the internet for more examples of what's active and what's passive. But passive just means that the subject is the recipient or target of the action. So if you say something like, Mike was moved to Atlanta, this is also correct. It just has a different meaning. It just means that, like, a company or something. So Mike's company or employer or family or whoever else moved or made him move to Atlanta. Okay, this is the difference between the active and the passive voice. Okay, it's not an error, and in fact, there's not even a preference. Okay, here are some statistics from OG12. There are 33 splits between the active voice and the passive voice. Of those 33 splits, the way they're decided is 17 of them are decided in favor of the passive, and the other 16 are decided in favor of the active. Notice that are decided, by the way, is passive voice, and again, that's fine, because we don't care who's doing the deciding. So notice there's no preference here at all. It's like exactly half and half, or as exactly as you can be with an odd number of things. So there is no default preference between active and passive. Okay, do not use active versus passive as a guessing tool. Now, okay, some of you, if you have the older editions of our strategy guides, the strategy guides, at least some of them say there's a preference. The reason they say that is because in the earlier editions of the OG, the older ones, there used to be a big lopsided disparity in favor of the active. Okay, so in older editions of the OG, up to the 10th edition, there was a decently sizable margin or balance in favor of the active. Therefore, if the strategy guide that you have, if your strategy guide says favor active over passive, that's old news, ignore it, it's not true anymore. We're going to take it out of the next edition. So if it says prefer active, do not listen to this anymore. It's not true anymore. So, okay. Homer, there's nothing that simple. There's no answer choice, which is decidedly more often true than others. The only answer choice in any question type which is ever statistically significant is that in data sufficiency, there are fewer answers that are E than other answers. So for other question types, it's basically exactly 50, 20, 20, 20, 20, 20. So, okay. How would you decide? Okay, so let's say you get a passive versus active type question. Then the question is, how would you decide between the passive and active? So Cyrus, no, remember we just spent the last 5 minutes saying you can't just say choose active. And that was the whole point of that last 5 minutes. How do we decide active versus passive? Okay, well here are a couple of choices. Let's say we had, here's a pair of sentences. Here are two options. I'm just going to make these up. When the time in the United States moves forward by an hour, the official time in Uruguay moves back by an hour. All right, and let me move that so it's visible on the screen. And then the other version of this will be this. When the official time in the U.S. is moved forward by an hour, the official time in Uruguay is moved back by an hour. Number two, let's say we had something like this. If you say, using a Geiger counter, the radioactive emissions from an object can be detected versus something like using a Geiger counter. Scientists can detect radioactive emissions from an object. Okay, what do you guys think of these? Let's do, for this pair, just pick A or B. Give me an A if you think it's the first one. Give me a B if you think it's the second one. No text box. Please still use the buttons. Still use these guys. Still use these buttons. I mean, your buttons still say A through E, but give me either A or B. Just for number one, not number two yet. So let's cover up 1 and 2. Okay. Most of you have an answer. A couple of you don't. If you need to guess, go ahead and guess. Okay. Here's what the class picked for this one. It was, a lot of you didn't answer, but the people who did answer, mostly A. This one's actually supposed to be B. Let's talk about why. Does anybody know why? Nishant, yeah. The difference is, and here's where we get the answer to this question, if you need to make this decision, it's like almost everything else. You have to use the meaning of the sentence. So, I mean, as with lots and lots and lots of other things, I mean, again, if you try to approach these things using nothing but grammar, you are definitely going to die. I mean, these sentences are not just grammar. Like, the best way to make sure that you're not ever going to improve, this is going to sound kind of harsh, but the best way to make sure that you're not really ever going to improve much is to approach sentence correction by using nothing but grammar all the time. I mean, grammar is important, yes, but meaning is just as important, if not more so. So, oh, okay. By can mean the agent of the action, but by also means like by this much. Like if you say I grew by 1 foot over the summer, then yeah, that's a separate. Okay, Garv, I see where you're coming from with that. Both okay if you say something like, if I say I grew by 6 inches over the summer, or the area of the rectangle is increased by 10%, or the area of the garden was increased by the gardener or the landscapers. These are two different uses of by. This is not the first one of these is not the passive voice kind of by. This is a by that's used with quantitative increases or decreases. Like if your tax liability increases by more than 10%, then so-and-so. So this is what this is. This doesn't mean an hour is moving things. This means that that's how much it moves by. So if any of you thought, I mean, in most cases, yes, by indicates an agent of an action. But in this case, it's like this. So this needs to be the passive voice because the time doesn't just move itself. These are incorrect because it suggests that the time just gets up and moves. So gets up and moves on its own. That doesn't make sense. So that's not right. But this does make sense because it is moved by somebody else. And that's how it has to work. So by the government or by whoever else. So, or by whomever else. Okay, so that works. Smiley face if that makes sense. Non-smiley if it doesn't. Okay. What about the other two? Again, please answer A and B using the buttons, not the text box. Buttons, A and B, for this one. Okay. Yeah, very good. The class mostly excellent on this one. Here's your answers. So mostly B. Let me make that a little bit smaller so it doesn't take up a ton of room. In this case, the passive is not the error, though. The passive is, yeah, this one's a modifier error because we don't know who is using the Geiger counter. So in this case, this kind of modifier requires a subject, and this kind of modifier needs a subject following subject. And you don't, so I mean, this implies that radioactive emissions are using a Geiger counter, which would be interesting to watch, but that can't happen. I mean, emissions can't, use machines. It would be very, like some sci-fi movie where the emissions like coagulate into some little beast and the beast starts using the Geiger counter, but you can't do that. On the other hand, in this case, we're legit, so scientists can detect. So sometimes the differences are not even having anything to do with the passive versus active. That's my point about this latter batch, is that sometimes when you see active versus passive, that's not even the split at hand. So, yeah. Okay, back to the question we were looking at. So no, actually nothing is passive anywhere in this entire problem. So whoever's asking about passive, make sure you Google passive voice and read up on it, because there is actually no passive voice anywhere in any of these choices. So, okay. Back to this. Because of diminishing doesn't work, this is not an okay idiom. That's not allowed. You can't say because of verbing. That's actually always incorrect. So you can put that in your book if you want to. Because of verbing is incorrect. That leaves us with A. Now the point that I wanted to make about this problem is that, and I mean the funny thing is that nobody picked the choices that don't have this. So apparently people must not have much of an issue with this. But this is the correct answer. The correct answer is A. So it's the same thing that's written there. The question that people have asked about this on the forum is, what about the ambiguous pronoun? Because technically it is an ambiguous pronoun. I mean, we don't know, technically speaking, if it's sulfur dioxide or if it's acid rain. Another super, super major point here is this. Cause of lots of pain and anguish on the forums and elsewhere. Ambiguous pronoun ambiguity is not necessarily an error. In fact, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of problems whose correct answers have technically ambiguous pronouns. Have correct answers with technically ambiguous pronouns. So, the basic deal then is that you should basically just ignore pronoun ambiguity for the most part. So the question is, what should I do about ambiguous pronouns? The answer is mostly ignore them. Don't really pay attention. It's not an elimination. With one exception, see the next slide, which we'll do in a second. So in other words, here's all that matters with pronouns. Is number one, does the pronoun have a noun to stand for? And if so, does it match that noun in terms of singular and plural? As long as these two things are satisfied, we frankly do not really care if the pronoun is ambiguous. So, yeah. Let's talk about this. So in this problem, we have to ignore the ambiguous pronouns. Some people were driven to choose choices like B and E because they wanted to get rid of the pronoun. Make sure you don't. Okay. The only time when you want to pay attention to pronoun ambiguity, let's introduce this on the next slide here. The only time when you should pay attention to pronoun ambiguity is when the pronoun is replaced with an actual noun in other answer choices. Okay, in that case, you should eliminate ambiguous pronouns. So let me give you a couple of examples from I'll give you a couple of examples. These are problems. They're from the OG Verbal Supplement, but they've also appeared in GMAT Prep, which makes them legitimate to use here. Here's another problem in which there's a technically ambiguous pronoun. So there's this one, while depressed property values can hurt. The correct answer here is A. So we don't need to show you the answer choices here. This is the correct answer. Notice that this correct answer contains an ambiguous pronoun. We don't know if it's technically this or if it's this. But we don't care because it's not. Dinesh, yeah, there's a parallelism issue like that, but we've also found exceptions to that. I mean, we've found okay ambiguous pronouns even when they are not grammatically parallel. So that turned out not to be bulletproof either. Okay, notice that we don't care because there's no replacement. Okay, this is never actually replaced. Pronoun is never actually replaced by a noun. In other words, you don't ever see they versus those values. So therefore, ignore the ambiguity. It's fine. Okay, versus, here's another problem. It'll appear on the board in a second. Another problem that also at some point has appeared on the GMAT Prep. That's this one. Notice in this case you actually have a, when this shows up on your screen, in this case you actually have a replacement. So here's a them, here's a them, here's a them, here's a these companies, here's a these companies, and here's a them. In this case, you actually have a replacement, this ambiguous pronoun. And notice that it's ambiguous. The ambiguity is that we don't know if it's customers or phone companies. This ambiguous pronoun is actually replaced by a noun. So, in this special case, you can eliminate on ambiguity. Okay. Again, the there issue, I would respond to that with the same issue as this. That's not replaced by another noun, so even if it is ambiguous, somehow it doesn't matter, because same response as this one. Ambiguity is only something you can reliably go on if it's actually replaced with another noun, as it is here. So this is significant because there are lots of official problems whose correct answers contain ambiguous pronouns. So the problem at hand is one of them, the one that we looked at. I mean, ironically, nobody actually picked based on pronouns here. So I think you either weren't paying attention to that, or you might be already aware of this. But what's frustrating about this is this is probably the first and only time that we've given you a rule that is actually based on what's in the answer choices rather than the actual grammar or meaning of the sentence. We don't like to do that. I mean, ideally, we would give you rules that are based on the inherent qualities of the sentence. But in this case, the GMAT is so frustratingly inconsistent about pronouns that this is the only rule that we've found that works. Like, in other words, any rule we've actually tried to make based on what's in the sentence, they've gone back and contradicted themselves many times over. So it's interesting. But we have not so far found a counterexample to this, where if they actually split ambiguous pronoun versus noun, then you should go with the noun. So a quick summary in fewer words of what we just saw, and then we'll look at a couple other problems. We're not going to get to the quant part today. A quick summary of the previous slide. Okay, if you just see an ambiguous pronoun, your response should be, I don't care. On the other hand, if you see ambiguous pronoun versus noun, then go ahead and kill the ambiguous pronoun. Pronoun proximity, I don't have any idea what that even means. Maybe you can give some examples or post it in the forum or something. If you've got examples on hand, then go ahead and post them. Otherwise, I don't actually even know what that means. I mean, if it means that the pronoun has to be close to the noun, then no, there's definitely no such rule. In fact, pronouns most often stand for nouns that are not terribly close to them. I mean, they're not usually across 5 or 6 lines either, but it's very rare for a pronoun to be really, really close to the noun. Okay. If you could find that in there and maybe post it in the forum on the general verbal folder. Okay. Let's see. We got a few minutes left. Let's see what else we've got on these slides here. We got a couple other problems. Here's another one. Let's try this guy. This will be the last problem of the day. So just quickly, let me update this slide to reflect this change. This topic here is going to be relegated to the next. Relegated is not the right word. It's going to be postponed to the next session. So this topic will be postponed to Thursday, 13th of April, 14th of April. Okay. Let's do it. Here's the problem. I'll clear out your answers again. Please use the buttons. Go for it. Okay, let's pick something if you've not already picked something. This one, by the way, is a GMAT prep problem. So please pick something. Okay, there's still a Danielle 2 with no answer and a 2 shots of happy with no answer. At this point, it's been over 2 minutes, so you got to have something, even if it's a random guess. You got to just bear down and pick something. Okay, I guess those 2 are sitting this one out. Danielle answered. I guess 2 shots of happy is sitting this one out. So here's the, remember you can't do that on the GMAT. I mean, you can't not answer problems, so be aware. Okay, here are the class statistics. Again, the non-responses, let's cover those up. All right. So mostly the issues here don't have to do with pronouns. We're running a little bit low on time, so I'll go ahead and make the explanations here a little bit snappy. The meaning of the sentence is that the sun will get rid of the hydrogen and then turn into a red giant, and that other stars would do basically the same thing. So this is a like modifier. The rule with like, does anybody know what the rule is for modifiers that start with like, or for comparisons involving like? What's the rule for that? Yeah, it has to be followed by a noun or perhaps a noun plus modifiers. So like must be followed by a noun, perhaps a noun plus modifiers, but definitely a noun. So the problem is that any star of similar mass would do is not a noun, that's a clause, that's a subject and a verb. So this is not okay. Any star of similar mass is fine, so that's not an issue. As in the case of, you can put as in front of prepositions, so that's fine. You can also put as in front of clauses. So in a comparison, as should be followed either by a clause or by a prepositional phrase. This in the case is a prepositional phrase, so we're good, and then as any star would, that's a clause, and would be the case is also a clause. So these are all legitimate. Let's look at verb tenses. Remember that verb tenses have nothing to do with grammar. Verb tenses are entirely based on meaning and context. So let's take a look at this. Does anybody have an opinion on this difference? Text box if you do. Expands versus will expand. Yeah, okay, it's present versus future, but why? So Cyrus, yes, we do need the future tense. Let's see if you can tell me why, or somebody else. The expands can be used for general truth, but this is not a general truth. I mean, this is something that has never happened. So the sun doesn't expand into red giant on a regular basis. I mean, so therefore the present tense, yes, the present tense can be used for general truths, but this is not a general truth. So here that's not applicable. You know, I mean, only if that happens on the regular, then would that count general truth kind of thing. So yeah, this hasn't happened yet. I mean, the point is the sun is still there, which is why the Earth is still chilling here. So the orange event hasn't happened yet. RP, what are you saying about if-thens? The wording of that makes me a little bit anxious. So let me see what you're saying there. The orange event hasn't happened yet, so we need the future tense. So these are not okay. All right. And then parallelism, let's take a look. This is a parallel signal, the and. So you don't have that in A, and you don't have that, actually you don't have that in A. Let's take a look at the parallelism. No, okay, RP, I got you, but what are you saying is the consequence of that? You're saying that if you have an if-then what? Like, what are you saying that means, or what are you saying you can deduce from that? That's what I'm wondering. Okay. This is eject and expands. That's decently parallel. This is ejecting, which is not parallel to anything over here. This is will eject, and this is will expand, so that's fine. And this is eject, and this is expand, so that's also fine. Okay. Lastly, we have D. D, we have a couple of problems. First, we have a pronoun issue. Let's look at pronouns. Actually, let's look at pronouns in general. There's an it. There's an it. There's an it. Okay, let's talk about what that is supposed to refer to. What is it intended to refer to? Because remember, ambiguous is not a problem here, because it is not replaced with anything. I mean, it is in all five. So there's no replacement here. Therefore, there's no replacement, therefore ambiguity is not an issue. Note that it is not replaced with the sun in any of these choices. So ambiguity, if there is ambiguity, is not an issue. Yeah, it is intended to refer to the sun. So it equals the sun. So notice that based on that, we can eliminate B, C, and D. Can anybody summarize quickly why? Okay, so some people are trying to actually assign that it to other nouns in B, C, and D. You don't want to do that because it's a waste of your time. Like, we know that it is the sun. That's what we know. From the meaning of the sentence, it is clearly intended to refer to the sun. So the point is that if the sun is not there, we don't want to waste our time assigning things. In choices B, C, and D, the sun is not there. Okay, this is not an ambiguity problem. It's wrong. So this is not an ambiguity problem. It's an error. It's wrong. Okay, so I mean there's 2 points here. Point number one is that possessives are not actually nouns at all. Possessives are adjectives, not nouns. So I mean, so the sun's core is like the red core, the blue core, the big core, the small core. Like functionally, they are adjectives. They're not nouns. So the only exception is in parallel structures. Let me just give you an example. The only exception to this is if you have a possessive, they can function as nouns in parallel structures. For example, if you say something like, my brother's wife is the same height as mine, or like is the same height as Joe's. So in this case, Joe's stands for Joe's wife. So because it's a parallel structure, then that's fine. But in any other instance, it's not. So for example, the son apostrophe S here counts as an adjective that modifies core. But the much more important point here, which is point 2, is that if the intended antecedent is not even there, then don't bother to assign a pronoun. I mean, this is really important. Like, a couple of you guys were actually like wandering around B, C, and D trying to figure out what it does stand for. Like, we really, really do not care. It doesn't make any difference. Like, the issue is that we know it's supposed to be the sun. B, C, and D don't contain the sun. So it is completely a waste of your time to try to assign this pronoun, because we don't care. Like, the noun that we want it to stand for is not there. So whatever it stands for, it's wrong. We don't have to bother. So very important. Like, just find the noun that it's supposed to refer to and see if it's there. If it's there, you're all good. Because remember, ambiguity, we don't care. If it's not there, it's wrong. There's no reason to hunt around and try to find out what it stands for. I mean, that's a huge, huge waste of time. Okay, RP, apparently you've kind of gone away somewhere, but if then does not do anything with verb tenses. If the if hasn't happened yet. Yeah, as long as it's not a hypothetical. If it were a hypothetical, then no. So if you have something like, if I were rich, then I would buy a house in Medellin. Like, that's, so yes, but only if you're talking about an event that reasonably has a chance of happening and is not supposed to be like an untrue hypothetical. So let me know if that, smiley face, if that makes sense, RP. Okay, good. All right, we are out of time. So, yes, Nishant, that's a good point. So the like modifier here is also incorrect because the following subject isn't immediately after the comma. So, yeah. Okay, we need to wrap it up. Remember, next time we are going to go to the rest of coordinate geometry, data sufficiency, and so on and so forth. Brief wrap up of what we've learned today about the which modifier. Remember that it can modify nouns that immediately precede the comma, which you knew, but it can also modify noun plus prep phrases. But you should not use the which modifier the way that people talk. You should not use it to modify entire clauses or whole ideas. Don't do that. Also, with ambiguity, there's all this noise about the passive voice. Remember that it's meaning. It's a meaning issue. It's not generally based on anything to do with grammar. It's a meaning issue. So watch out for that. Finally, pronoun ambiguity is not necessarily an error. If you see a split between an ambiguous pronoun and a noun replacement, then eliminate if it's the only time you want to. Otherwise, just take the ambiguous pronoun and smile at it and ignore it. Okay, next time we'll do this. Otherwise, we are done. We are going to close up shop here in a couple of minutes. If you have any super quick business-related questions or whatnot. So, yeah. Slide set. Well, technically, you are not supposed to be able to save the slide set. I can ask student services if we are allowed to give away the PDFs of these slides. I don't know if we are allowed to do that or not. So, if you want to shoot me an email, then I will ask. Otherwise, I want to make sure I'm not stepping on it. I mean, I would send it. If it was my choice, I'd go ahead and send it to you now. but I want to make sure we're not stepping on anybody's toes with things like proprietary content and whatnot. So the answer to that is I don't know. I'll get back to you. But go ahead and shoot me an email and we'll figure it out. Okay, anybody else? Otherwise, I'm going to start logging you guys out here in the next couple minutes so that we can get moving. Thanks for attending, and I'm going to kill the recording at this point. And if you don't log out in the next, you don't even have to log out, actually. You can just quit the program. It'll take care of itself. If you don't quit in the next 30 seconds, I'll go ahead and log you guys out. Good night and good luck.